My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 36, and for as long as I can remember, my family treated me like I didn't count while my brother Ethan was celebrated as the golden child. I was the one brushed aside, forgotten. Then came the family chat. Ethan typed, "Stay home, Rachel. This is only for real families." That cut deep, but this time my daughter saw it too. They assumed I'd stay silent, the same outsider as always. But what they didn't know was the truth I carried, and the shock waiting for them the moment they stepped into my resort. I was sitting in my office late in the afternoon, paperwork stacked high on my desk, when my phone buzzed. The group chat lit up. Family trip, Beach House 2025. For anyone else, that might have sounded warm like tradition. But for me, the name alone carried weight. I knew this year would not be different. Not really. I opened the chat, half expecting to see the usual cheerful planning. Instead, the first message stopped me cold. It was from my brother Ethan. "Stay home, Rachel. This is only for real families." The words stared back at me, sharp finale. Before I could even type a response, another message arrived. This one from my father, Charles. "Ethan's right. You're busy with work. You don't need to come. Let your brother handle family matters." I froze, phone in hand. On the surface, it looked like harmless planning, but I knew better. These weren't simple words, they were another reminder of where I stood in this family. On the outside, I felt movement beside me. Olivia, my 14-year-old daughter, leaned over to glance at my screen. I hadn't meant for her to see it, but she did. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes, usually full of curiosity, now carried something else. Pain, embarrassment, and under it all, a flicker of anger. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. The silence between us said more than any words. I had endured this treatment my whole life, but for her to witness it, it cut deeper. Memories rushed in. Countless holidays at that beach house where Ethan had the best room while I was sent to share with cousins. Years of being reminded I was less. I thought I had grown numb, but watching Olivia read those words, I realized the wound never closed. It had only been covered. Ethan's message replayed in my mind. "This is only for real families." What did that even mean? That my hard work, my sacrifices, raising a daughter alone, building my own path, none of it mattered. To them, family meant Ethan. Always Ethan. And anyone else was expendable. I looked at Olivia. Her eyes shone not with tears, but with a strength I hadn't seen before. She whispered, almost too soft to catch, "Why do they treat you like that?" I didn't answer right away. My throat was tight. She deserved honesty, but at that moment the truth was a weight I wasn't sure she should have to carry. Instead, I reached out and squeezed her hand. Inside, though, something shifted. I had stayed quiet all my life, swallowing their dismissals, letting them decide where I fit. But Olivia had seen enough. And I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. I placed my phone face down on the desk. My pulse was steady, but my mind was racing. They thought they had silenced me again, shoved me to the margins with a single message. Not this time. I didn't reply in the chat. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Instead, I sat back in my chair, looked out at the Miami skyline, and made myself a silent promise. They would regret calling me an outsider. I glanced back at Olivia, who was still staring at the phone as though it had betrayed her. I gave her a small nod. A promise unspoken but clear. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's get dinner. We've got better things to do tonight." She followed me, quiet, thoughtful. But her hand in mine told me she understood. By the time we left the office, the pain had hardened into something else. Resolve. They believed they could erase me from the family with a line of text. What they didn't know was that they had just lit the fuse. And as I stepped into the night air, I knew this year's family trip would be unlike any before. Because I wasn't going to stay home. They had opened the story, but I would be the one to finish it. When Ethan typed that I wasn't real family, I didn't just hear his words in the present. I heard echoes from years ago. His message wasn't new. It was just the latest version of something I had been told my whole life. I remember being 8 years old, standing barefoot on the grass in our front yard. The Florida sun was hot on my shoulders, the grass prickly under my toes. My father was talking to our neighbors, his hand resting proudly on Ethan's shoulder like he was displaying a trophy. "This boy," he said, puffing out his chest, "will grow up to be a great lawyer one day." The neighbors nodded, impressed. I lingered nearby, hoping for even a glance of acknowledgement. Instead, my father turned, handed me the empty iced tea glasses, and said, "Rachel, take these inside and set the table." Moments like that stayed with me. Ethan got the spotlight. I got chores. Summers at the beach house made the contrast impossible to ignore. Ethan always had the biggest room overlooking the ocean. He'd stand on the balcony, arms spread wide, declaring it his future kingdom. I, meanwhile, was told to share a bunk room with cousins, the air stuffy, the view blocked by hedges. Each year, I told myself it didn't matter. But each time I unfolded my clothes in that cramped space, the sting returned fresh as ever. Birthdays carried the same message. On Ethan's 10th birthday, he wheeled out a brand new red bike chrome, gleaming, the kind of gift that made all the neighborhood kids stare in envy. Months later, on my birthday, Dad rolled out a spray-painted hand-me-down. "Good as new," he said, patting the handlebars. I forced a smile, but I couldn't ignore the chipped paint, the squeaky pedals, or the way Ethan smirked as he rode circles around me on his shiny wheels. School was no escape. I poured myself into essays, projects, and competitions. When I won a county essay contest in 6th grade, Mom hugged me in the kitchen, whispering how proud she was. But when I showed Dad the certificate, he barely looked up from his paper. "Good," he said. But Ethan's mock trial is next week. That's the real test. To him, my efforts were invisible, eclipsed by Ethan's shadow. Mom Linda saw more than she said. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me with soft eyes, as if words hovered on her lips. But she never spoke to them aloud. Her silence became another wall I had to push against. I think she believed staying quiet was safer than questioning my father. But her quietness felt like another kind of dismissal. The night I announced I wanted to major in hospitality at the University of Miami still plays in my memory like a film. We were at dinner, roast chicken steaming on the table, mashed potatoes passed around. I straightened my back, cleared my throat, and said, "I've decided. I'm going to study hospitality and business." For a second, the table fell silent. Then came the laughter. Ethan leaned back, grinning. "Perfect," he said loudly, so even the cousins at the end could hear. "One day Rachel will be mixing cocktails for me at the beach house." The table roared. Even my father chuckled, nodding as though Ethan had delivered some great truth. My face burned, but I kept my eyes on my plate. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. Inside, though, a promise took root. If Ethan thought I was destined to serve him drinks, I would turn that insult into fuel. I would go further than any of them imagined. Still, there were flickers of light in the shadows. I remember the day I won a middle school hospitality club award for organizing a mock event. It was nothing, just folding napkins, planning a pretend banquet, but the teacher praised my eye for detail. For once, the applause in that small auditorium was directed at me. My family didn't bother to show up, but I carried that ribbon home like treasure. I hid it in a shoebox under my bed. Whenever Ethan's laughter rang too loud, I'd take it out, run my fingers along the frayed edge, and remind myself I had something he couldn't take away. That shoebox became my secret vault. Certificates, small trophies, notes from teachers, tiny testaments that I was capable of, even if no one in my family cared to see it. It was my quiet rebellion, proof I was more than the girl with chores and hand-me-downs. 30 years later, Ethan's words on the family chat still carried the same tone as his voice at that dinner table. His message, "Stay home, Rachel. This is only for real families," wasn't new. It was just older, recycled, sharper now because Olivia read it too. As I stared at that text, memories pressed in the spray-painted bike, the balcony. I was never allowed the laughter at the table. He thought nothing had changed. He thought I was still that little girl carrying glasses, setting tables, swallowing humiliation in silence. But I wasn't her anymore. He had no idea how much I had built, how far I had come, how prepared I was for the moment when truth would finally break through. He believed I wasn't worthy of stepping into the beach house. What he didn't know was that I was already standing on the balcony of something much bigger. And soon Ethan and the entire family would see it for themselves. Turning 18 came with a truth I could no longer ignore in my family. I would never be enough. If I wanted a place in the world, I would have to carve it out for myself. That thought sat heavy on my shoulders as I packed my things and filled out the application to the University of Miami. I chose hospitality and business. To my family, it was a joke. To me, it was a way forward. I still remember the smirk on Ethan's face when he heard. "So what's the plan, Rachel?" "You're going to learn how to fold napkins and carry trays?" Dad chuckled along, adding, "It's her choice. At least it'll keep her busy." I didn't answer. Instead, I started working at a coffee shop a few blocks from campus. The hours were long morning shifts before class, late evenings after group projects. I'd wipe down tables with one hand while holding flashcards in the other, cramming terms from my MBA courses. Customers came and went, some ignoring me completely, others snapping their fingers for a refill. Whenever Ethan visited home from law school, he'd toss his designer briefcase onto the couch, glance at my apron and say, "Looks like you're really moving up in the world." Dad would laugh, shaking his head as if to say, "I told you so." They didn't know what I was really doing with those paychecks. Every tip, every dollar I earned went into research. I subscribed to trade journals, bought case studies on resort management, even paid for weekend seminars. While Ethan networked at firm dinners, I was sketching layouts for my own property, running numbers late into the night. By 2014, the split between us grew wider. Ethan threw a party to celebrate joining one of Miami's top law firms. The photos filled social media, him, clinking glasses of champagne, Dad by his side, looking proud. Sophie already in the picture back then, smiling for the cameras. In the same week, I cut the ribbon on my very first resort in Key West. The property wasn't glamorous by their standards. 24 rooms, a renovated pool, and a tiny restaurant attached. But it was mine. My employees cheered, locals came by to see the opening, and Daniel Brooks, then just a fresh graduate I had hired as front desk staff, stood beside me full of hope. My family didn't show up. Not one of them. When I called Dad afterward, voice still shaky with excitement, he sighed. "That's nice, Rachel. But you know these little experiments don't last. Stability comes from real professions, like law." I hung up before he could continue. That night I walked through the empty lobby, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, smelling fresh paint, and promised myself that no matter how small it started, this would not fail. The first months were brutal. Guests complained about wait times. Suppliers missed deliveries, and once during a storm, the roof leaked so badly that I spent the night in the lobby with buckets lined up across the floor. I could have quit. I almost did. But then I'd hear Ethan's laughter in my head, mocking me about folding napkins, and it would push me to keep going. Daniel became my right hand. He wasn't just efficient. He believed in the vision even when it was hard to see. We learned together how to handle bookings, how to soothe angry guests, how to stretch a dollar so payroll never slipped. He often said, "One day this place will be the model people copy." I wanted to believe him. Year after year, the work paid off. In 2017, I opened a second property in South Carolina. By 2020, there was another in California. Each one was bigger, sharper, more polished. By 2024, Carter's Seaside Group was no longer just an idea. It was a chain of 9 thriving resorts across the country. Still, I stayed quiet. I let my family think I was just managing hotels, scraping by, still the same girl they used to overlook. I wanted the reveal to come in its own time with its own weight. The contrast between us became impossible to miss. Ethan strutted around in tailored suits, bragging about corporate clients and courtroom victories. Dad paraded him around golf clubs like a trophy. Meanwhile, I signed contracts with investors, negotiated land deals, and expanded my empire silently without their applause. And now, as they crossed my name off the list for the beach house trip, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. They thought I didn't belong at their table. They thought I was still the coffee girl with the hand-me-down bike. but I knew better. I was no longer knocking on their door for a seat. I was the one holding the keys to doors they hadn't even seen yet. And soon, they would have to walk through mine. The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and garlic bread, the very dishes my mother used to serve when we were children. The oak table gleamed beneath the chandelier, polished so thoroughly it caught reflections like a mirror. On the surface, it could have been a portrait of family tradition. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew it wasn't dinner. It was a trial. And I was the one seated in the dock. The scrape of chairs against marble echoed like a gavel striking wood. Glasses chimed. Silverware tapped in small rhythms. Every gesture rehearsed, every movement calculated to maintain the performance of unity. But under it all was a quiet tension, wound tighter and tighter, waiting for someone to make the first move. Ethan settled at the head of the table. He had never been asked to sit there. He simply claimed it years ago and no one challenged him. Leaning back, he spun his wine glass between his fingers, wearing the expression of a man convinced he belonged in that chair. Sophie angled herself toward him, sequins on her dress catching the chandelier's glow, her entire presence designed to shine beside him. He cleared his throat, his voice smooth and deliberate. "This year's trip will be the best yet," he said, pausing for effect. "Private yacht, rooftop dinners, the works. Everything is first class." His smirk widened, waiting for applause. Sophie supplied it with a soft laugh, brushing her hand over his arm. Then she turned her smile toward me, a curve of lips sharpened like a blade. "Rachel, you probably wouldn't enjoy that kind of vacation anyway. Maybe something simpler would suit you better." Her tone was airy, but the dismissal underneath was heavy cold. Polite chuckles rippled down the table, the sound of practiced agreement. Even the silverware seemed to join their chorus. Then my father spoke. Charles Carter never raised his voice at the table. He didn't need to. His tone carried finality like a verdict handed down from the bench. He lifted his glass, tilting it toward Ethan with pride etched into every line of his face. "Ethan is the one keeping our traditions alive," he said. "The beach house will be his one day as it should." Rachel, his eyes slid to me, cold and dismissive focus on your small work. "Leave family responsibilities to your brother." The words fell like a gavel striking. Final. Unappealable. Across from me, Olivia froze mid-bite, her fork suspended in the air. At 14, she hadn't yet learned the family art of masks. Color flushed her cheeks as her hand slipped under the table to grip mine. Her young fingers trembled, pressing into my palm with silent outrage. I squeezed back, steadying her even as my own pulse throbbed. My eyes stayed lowered, locked on my plate where the roasted chicken cooled untouched. Around me, the rhythm of clinking glasses and muted laughter blurred into static. And in that static, memory came unbidden. I saw myself no older than 10 sitting at this very table. Ethan had just won a debate competition, and my father stood to toast him, his voice booming with pride. Neighbors gathered, smiling in admiration. My plate was empty. I was told to carry out dessert. "You'll have your turn," Dad had said, though we both knew I never would. Now, decades later, the roles hadn't changed. Ethan still basked in the spotlight. Sophie still polished his image, and my father still crowned him heir with every approving nod. And me, I was still expected to serve silent and invisible. But not this time. I raised my head, drawing a breath to speak. Before the words even left my lips, my father cut across me with the sharpness of a blade. He turned to the butler at the corner of the room. "Bring out the tart," he commanded, ignoring me entirely. "The children are finished here." The dismissal was deliberate. A public reminder that I didn't count. That my voice had no place at this table. Olivia's grip tightened under the table, fierce, almost painful. Her eyes burned unblinking as she watched me swallow the humiliation that had defined my entire life. Ethan leaned back, smugness restored, spinning his glass again, as if the interruption had been orchestrated for his benefit. Sophie's laughter followed, thin and sharp, echoing in the polished air. They thought their words, their interruptions, their laughter would weaken me, but in truth they were carving my resolve into stone. So I sat still. I let Ethan bask in his imaginary throne. I let Sophie sharpen her smiles into dismissal. I let my father reinforce the pedestal he had built decades ago, and while they rehearsed their roles, I wrote mine in silence. The meal dragged on, every boast another stone laid on the wall between us. When the lemon tart was finally served, a recipe that had once been my mother's pride, now prepared by staff, I placed my napkin down carefully. "Excuse me," I said, my tone calm, my smile practiced. No one stopped me. Why would they? To them, my absence was barely a gap. I rose my chair, sliding softly against the marble. For a fleeting second, I glanced at my father. He didn't look at me. His gaze remained fixed on Ethan as though I had never stood at all. That, more than his words, was the final judgment. Outside, the Miami night pressed hot and thick against my skin. Cicadas hummed in the distance, life carrying on beyond the Carter table. I slipped into my car, closed the door, and let silence swallow their laughter. Then I reached for my phone. "Daniel," I said when he answered. My voice was low, steady, unshaken. "Confirm everything. The suite, the paperwork, the welcome screens. Every detail must be flawless." His reply was immediate. "Already in motion, Rachel. By the time they arrive, your name will be impossible to miss." I ended the call and leaned back, a small smile tugging at my lips. Inside that dining room, they still laughed, certain they had erased me again. Certain they had silenced me. But what they didn't know was that the truth was already written on contracts, on plaques, on every polished corner of the resort they believed was theirs. I started the engine. The headlights sliced through the dark streets of Coral Gables, cutting a clean line into the night. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the forgotten guest leaving the table. I felt like the one holding the pen, and I was ready to turn the page. The Miami skyline stretched out beyond my office window, washed in the pale blue of early morning. The city was waking up, but I had been awake long before the sun. My phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at the screen. The family group chat lit up with a new message. On the way to the airport, attached was a photo Ethan with Sophie, both grinning as though they owned the world. Ethan in his tailored casual suit, sunglasses perched on his head. Sophie's hand looped proudly through his arm. They looked smug, confident, untouchable. The kind of confidence built not on truth, but on entitlement. I stared at the photo for a long moment. They believed they had everything. They believed I was out of the picture. If only they knew where I had slept last night. While they were packing suitcases, I walked the polished halls of the Seaside Crown Resort. I stood in the presidential suite, running my hand along the marble counters, checking that every detail matched my instructions. The welcome screens had been updated to show my name. The brass plaque at the lobby now gleamed, "Owned by Rachel Carter." This morning I wasn't on my way to the airport. I was sipping coffee on the terrace of the very suite Ethan thought he had claimed. At Miami International Airport, the rest of the family gathered. I didn't need to be there to picture it. Ethan leading the way, chest out the proud son, and future heir in his own mind. Sophie on his arm, glancing at her phone every few seconds, no doubt preparing to post about her luxury getaway. My father trailing just behind, carrying himself with the dignity of a man who still believed he controlled the family narrative. I imagined the way they looked at each other, exchanging smiles, satisfied that this trip would be smoother without me around. They probably whispered their theories. Rachel was too busy with her small job. She couldn't handle the expense. She chose not to come because she can't keep up. What they didn't know was that every mile their plane traveled only brought them closer to me. On the resort's security feed, the cameras caught every detail in crisp clarity. My laptop screen became a theater, and I sat quietly as the show began. Their plane landed, and I watched Ethan descend the stairs first, straightening his jacket as though paparazzi were waiting. He turned back, offering Sophie his hand. She laughed, her hair catching the Florida sun. Behind them, my father stepped down slowly, his pride practically radiating. From my vantage point, hundreds of miles away, I saw it all as though I was standing there. Daniel Brooks had synced the feed to my computer, giving me a front-row seat to the spectacle. On their ride from the airport, I imagined the conversations filling the limousine. Ethan held court, telling everyone about the suite he had secured. Sophie scrolled through her phone planning captions about ocean views and yacht dinners. My father nodded content that Ethan was taking charge as the leader of the Carter family. They believed my absence meant victory. They believed pushing me out had left me diminished. They had no idea the very ground they were driving toward bore my name. In the suite, I walked over to the safe tucked behind the walnut-paneled wall. I entered the code, listening to the soft click as the lock was released. Inside lay the documents, ownership deeds, contracts, legal seals. Years of work bound in paper, undeniable proof of what was mine. I had kept them untouched, waiting for the day they would no longer be silent pages but evidence. Today was that day. I sat back at the desk, laptop open once again, eyes fixed on the live feed. The limousine turned down the palm-lined road that led to the grand gates of Seaside Crown. The camera caught Ethan's smile widening. He leaned forward, pointing at the building that rose in the distance, gleaming white against the Florida sun. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ethan thought this was his playground. My father thought this was his legacy. Sophie thought it was her stage. They didn't realize they were about to step into my house, my rules, my world. For a brief moment, I let myself breathe in the anticipation. The years of being overlooked, dismissed, laughed at, it had all led to this. And it wasn't just about revenge. It was about proof. Proof that I had carved something out of nothing, that I had built a foundation no one could ignore, no matter how hard they tried. The limousine slowed as it neared the front entrance. The doormen in crisp uniforms lined up, prepared to greet the incoming guests. My family would see the bowing heads, the polished marble floors, the grandeur of the lobby. But they would not see me, at least not yet. I leaned closer to the screen, watching Ethan step out first, flashing that same grin I had seen in the photo earlier. The grin of someone who thought he had won. Sophie followed, holding her phone high to capture every moment. My father adjusted his tie, taking in the sight like a king surveying his kingdom. My lips curved into a small, quiet smile. They believed this was their stage. They had no idea it was my stage all along. I closed the laptop slowly, the screen fading to black. The sound of the limousine engine hummed faintly through the feed before it cut off. For a long moment, the silence in the suite pressed against me. Then I stood, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain. From this height, I could see the palm trees swaying in the breeze, the driveway stretching out like a red carpet for their arrival. Any second now, they would pass through the grand glass doors. And when they did, the world they thought belonged to them would collapse in the face of the truth. I let the curtain fall back into place and whispered to myself, "It begins." From the tall windows of the presidential suite, I could see the gates swing open. The Florida sun bounced off the gold letters carved into the front sign, Carter Seaside Group. Below, the black limousine slid into the driveway, its paint catching the light like a mirror. My family had arrived. Ethan was the first to step out. He slid off his sunglasses, fixed his shirt cuffs, and lifted his chin high. Every move rehearsed as if he were walking into a courtroom with cameras pointed at him. Sophie clung to his arm, her phone already raised, capturing the moment for her followers. Behind them came my father. Charles' shoulders pulled back, the kind of stride that carried ownership, even though it wasn't his. I stayed still behind the curtain, watching. Ethan smiled with satisfaction as the staff lined up at the entrance, bowing slightly in greeting. He thought that welcome was for him. He thought his name had pulled those heads down. In truth, they were bowing for me. Inside the lobby, the cool air carried the scent of polished wood and citrus oil. Ethan marched forward. Sophie on display beside him, her camera lens sweeping over marble floors and chandeliers. They looked around as though they'd built this place themselves. My father followed, nodding with approval like a king inspecting his court. Then Ethan strode directly to the front desk. He dropped his passport on the polished counter with a thud. His voice carried across the lobby, firm, commanding, sure of itself. Presidential suite. For me and my girlfriend. Make it quick. Sophie laughed softly, leaning into him, her arm draped over his shoulders. She whispered loud enough for those nearby to hear, "This is the kind of life we deserve." Staff behind the counter shifted their smiles, fixed their eyes flicking toward Daniel Brooks, the resort manager. Daniel had been waiting, calm, steady, every detail already discussed with me. He picked up the tablet, scrolled once, then looked up. His tone was polite, but carried a weight that silenced the room. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. The presidential suite is already occupied. By the owner." The words fell into the lobby like stones dropped into still water. For a moment, nobody moved. Sophie's smile froze. My father blinked. Ethan lowered his sunglasses, his eyes narrowing as if he hadn't heard correctly. "The owner," he said louder this time, the sound bouncing against the marble. "There is no other owner. I booked this entire property for my family." Daniel didn't flinch. "The resort belongs to its rightful owner, sir. The instructions for your family's stay have been prepared. If you'll follow me, I'll take you to your accommodations." A ripple of murmurs spread among the staff and the few guests passing through. Sophie's brows knit together, confusion flickering across her face. My father's jaw tightened, the flush creeping up his neck. The family exchanged quick, uneasy glances, whispering as though the air itself had betrayed them. From my window above, I pressed my fingertips lightly to the glass, steadying my breath. I could see the shift in their posture, the way Ethan's shoulders stiffened, the way Sophie stepped back slightly, the way my father's pride bent, even if just for a second. Ethan leaned across the counter, lowering his voice, but not enough. "This is a mistake. Check again. I don't share space with anyone, especially not when I've booked the presidential suite." Daniel's lips curved in the faintest smile. He didn't raise his voice, but each word struck clean. "Sir, I assure you it's not a mistake. Your family's booking has been confirmed for standard suites only." That was the arrangement, and the presidential suite remains under the authority of the owner. Those instructions will not change. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Sophie dropped her phone into her purse, no longer filming. My father stepped forward, his voice carrying more frustration than control. "Ethan, leave it. We'll sort this out later." But Ethan wasn't ready to back down. He turned sharply toward Daniel, pointing a finger. "I know how this works. Money talks. I'm not just some guest. Do you know who I am?" Daniel held his gaze steady as stone. "Yes, Mr. Carter. And I also know exactly who owns this resort. If you'll come with me, I'll show you to your rooms." Sophie crossed her arms, her expression slipping from amusement to irritation. My father muttered under his breath a word I couldn't catch, but the stiffness in his body told me enough. They were rattled. From above, I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Years of being treated as invisible, years of sitting silent at family tables, it was here unfolding before my eyes. They had walked into my world, carrying all their arrogance, and the first wall had just risen in front of them. Daniel gestured toward the corridor. Staff moved quickly, collecting luggage, guiding the Carters forward. Ethan hesitated, but followed his jaw. Clenched sunglasses shoved back over his eyes to mask whatever flashed behind them. Sophie whispered furiously into his ear, but even she couldn't keep her poise now. I watched as they were led toward the pavilion, their footsteps echoing against polished stone. Their voices grew faint as the doors closed behind them. Then I stepped back from the curtain, my own reflection faint against the glass. I steadied myself, my pulse quick and strong. This was only the beginning. The first crack had appeared. The rest would follow. And as they walked deeper into the resort, deeper into the stage I had built for them, I whispered softly into the silence of the suite, "Let the game begin." The pavilion sat on the edge of the shore, its glass walls glowing under the orange wash of the late afternoon sun. The waves outside crashed steady, the breeze rattled the palm leaves. But no one in my family seemed to notice. They were led inside by Daniel, each step echoing against the marble floor. Their faces carried the same question: who had dared to block Ethan from what he believed was his right. Ethan walked in front, jaw tight. Sophie a half step behind him, heels clicking in irritation. My father followed slower, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the grandeur of the room. To them, this was supposed to be the stage of their celebration. Instead, it was about to become something else. At Daniel's signal, the room dimmed. A hush fell over the pavilion as a massive screen dropped from the ceiling. The logo appeared first shining in Gold Carter Seaside Group. My family leaned forward, eyes widening as photographs rolled across the screen: Key West, Charleston, San Diego. Each resort pristine, filled with guests, a portfolio of success lined up one after another. And then the words lit up in bold, undeniable letters: owned by Rachel Carter. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. I heard Sophie's breath catch from across the room. My father muttered under his breath, barely audible, "This can't be real." Ethan didn't move. His face flushed, his fists clenched, but for once he didn't have words ready. I stepped quietly from the shadow of the back entrance, pausing just long enough to let the reveal settle. Ethan turned his head sharply when he heard the sound of my heels against the floor. His eyes widened when he saw me standing there, not in work attire, not in the plain clothes they were used to mocking. I had chosen something simple: a deep blue dress, clean lines and understated. I didn't need anything more. Ethan barked out a laugh, sharp and hollow. "This is a joke. She's a manager here, that's all. Someone's playing tricks." He looked at my father. "Dad, tell them. Tell them she doesn't own anything." My father stayed silent. He kept his eyes fixed on the screen, the weight of the letters staring back at him. Daniel walked forward, a thick folder in his hands. He placed it on the long table at the center of the pavilion and spoke with calm authority. "According to notarized documents dated June 2018, Seaside Crown Resort and its assets belong solely to Mrs. Rachel Carter. These records are legal, binding, and public. Your family," he paused, letting the words hang, "are guests here. Nothing more." Sophie's mouth dropped open. She shifted her gaze to Ethan, but he avoided her eyes. My father's lips parted as if to object, but no sound came out. The weight of silence was louder than anything else. Ethan tried again, louder this time, forcing a smirk onto his face. "Paperwork can be forged. This doesn't mean anything. Rachel has always exaggerated. She's pretending. She can't possibly." "Enough," I said, my voice steady. They turned toward me. I stepped closer, letting each movement sink in. For years I had walked quietly in this family, choosing silence over confrontation. Not today. I stopped in front of Ethan, my gaze meeting him directly. "Welcome," I said slowly. My words measured sharp in their simplicity. "Welcome to my property." The pavilion seemed to contract around us, the space tightening with the shock. Sophie's lips trembled as she whispered, She owns this." My father pressed a hand to the table, grounding himself, but still couldn't lift his head to face me. For the first time in my life, there was no debate, no laughter, no patronizing reminders that I was the other child. There was only silence. Their silence was my answer. Ethan's voice dropped low, almost desperate. "Do you think this changes anything? You think running some hotels makes you better than this family?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The proof had already been spoken. The slides still rotated behind me, each image carrying my name, each resort, another piece of evidence they couldn't erase. I turned away, giving Daniel a small nod. He closed the folder, the sound snapping through the stillness. My family stood frozen, unable to retreat, unable to deny. For once, the power was mine. And as I walked past them toward the head of the pavilion, where the words, "Owned by Rachel Carter," still glowed on the screen, I knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning. "Now," I said softly but loud enough for them to hear, "let's see how much family really means when the truth is standing in front of you." Their faces told me everything. "Ethan." Pale Sophie, stunned my father's authority, cracked in half, and I walked forward, calm, certain, knowing that the storm I had waited for was finally here. The pavilion had never felt so heavy. The air seemed to tighten, pressing down on everyone inside. My family stood frozen in the center, their postures stiff, their faces pale. Behind them, lined up near the entrance, were the resort employees. They didn't even try to hide the way they looked at me, with respect, with recognition. That simple acknowledgement was something my own family had never given me. I raised a hand, slightly a small gesture. Daniel understood right away. He walked to the long table, placed a neat folder on it, and opened it with deliberate calm. His voice carried steady and professional. According to the agreement signed, the Carter family has no claim to the presidential suite. The contract Mr. Ethan Carter submitted only secures standard rooms. All premium services remain reserved for other clients. Ethan's head snapped up, his voice booming so loudly it echoed through the pavilion. That's nonsense. I booked the entire resort. Daniel didn't flinch. He looked directly at Ethan, his tone still polite but firm. You may have placed a request, but only Mrs. Carter has final approval, and she did not approve any of your demands. The words landed like stones. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. My father's face turned a deep shade of red. He stepped forward, voice rising with a mix of anger and disbelief. Rachel, how could you do this to your own family? I turned my eyes on him. My voice was even, not loud, but cutting enough that every person in the room heard. I didn't do this to you, Dad. You and Ethan made me an outsider a long time ago. Today I'm only showing everyone the truth. The silence after that was sharp like glass. Even Olivia, sitting near the side, barely moved. Her hand gripped the edge of her chair. But her eyes glowed with something new. Pride. It was the first time she saw me refuse to bow my head. Then a quiet voice broke the silence. Excuse me, it said, trembling but determined. All eyes turned toward the young woman standing near the back. Maria Sanchez. She wore the uniform of the housekeeping staff, her hands still holding the notepad she used for service requests. She stepped forward, her voice stronger now. Mr. Ethan once humiliated me at the front desk. He called me useless, just because I dropped a towel. Gasps rose from the staff lined along the wall. Ethan's mouth fell open. Sophie looked mortified, pulling her phone down as if she didn't want the moment captured. My father glanced between them, his expression faltering. I didn't hesitate. I turned to Daniel. Record her statement. And from this moment, Maria Sanchez is promoted to Supervisor of Guest Services. The pavilion erupted. Employees exchanged looks of surprise, then clapped softly, some nodding toward Maria with smiles. Her eyes welled up as she covered her mouth, whispering a thank you. Ethan sputtered, pointing at me. You don't, this is ridiculous. I faced him fully. I can, and I do. This resort doesn't reward cruelty, not anymore. The atmosphere shifted entirely. What had begun as a quiet confrontation was now a public reckoning. My family wasn't just facing me, they were being exposed before the very people they had dismissed as unimportant. Ethan's composure snapped. He lunged forward as if he could reclaim the authority slipping through his fingers. But before he reached me, 2 resort security officers stepped in, blocking his path. Their presence was calm, controlled, yet final. Ethan froze, breathing hard, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. From the corner, I heard the unmistakable sound of a phone camera shutter. Then another. Staff members were already capturing the scene, the air of the Carter family being stopped by security in a resort he once claimed as his own. Sophie tugged at his sleeve, whispering urgently, Ethan, stop, they're filming. But it was too late. The images were already being taken. His outburst, his helplessness the moment he realized his power meant nothing here, it was all preserved. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply looked at him and said, this is what happens when respect is earned, not demanded. He glared back at me, but for once he had no answer. The pavilion stood still for a long moment, every eye fixed on us. My family, once so proud, so untouchable, stood stripped of their authority. And I, the one they had pushed aside, had turned the very ground beneath them. The first cracks had formed, and I knew those cracks were only going to spread. The moment security stepped in to block Ethan's outburst, I thought maybe, just maybe, he would stop. But no. He pulled out his phone like it was a weapon and spoke loud enough for everyone in the pavilion to hear. I'll call my lawyer. He snapped, his voice dripping with defiance. We'll see how strong this little contract of yours really is. My father's face softened in relief, his lips curving into the first trace of a smile all day. Yes, he muttered. Nodding, get Miller. He'll settle this. The rest of the family stirred behind him, clinging to the thought like it was their salvation. They truly believed a lawyer could erase the truth written in stone and could pull them out of the trap they had walked into. I said nothing. I sat back in my chair, calm hands folded on the table. I had learned long ago that silence unsettles people more than shouting. Across the room, Olivia caught my eye. Her gaze was steady, curious, as if asking, "What will you do now?" I only gave her a small nod. I had already prepared for this moment. 1 hour later, the pavilion doors swung open again. He arrived exactly as I remembered him from years ago, Miller, the Carter family attorney. His hair had gone mostly gray, but his shoulders carried the same weight of practiced authority. He wore a perfectly pressed suit, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor as he strode forward. A leather briefcase swung at his side, and with a snap, he set it on the table, opening it with a flourish, like he was about to win a case in front of a jury. According to the agreement, Miller began, his voice sharp. Confident, rehearsed, "My clients are entitled to the full use of resort services. That includes the presidential suite." His words rolled across the room, heavy and certain. Ethan stood tall behind him, arms folded, his smirk returning, as if Miller's presence alone restored his crown. Sophie leaned closer to him, whispering something I couldn't hear, but I saw her shoulders relax. Even my father straightened his chest, lifting as if Miller's voice had already rewritten the facts. I let them savor it for a moment. Let them taste hope. Then I gave Daniel a small signal. Without a word, Daniel walked forward, carrying a binder that dwarfed Miller's briefcase. He placed it squarely on the table and opened it with deliberate calm. The papers inside were thick, marked with blue and gold ribbons, every page stamped and notarized. He turned the first page, sliding it gently toward the center so everyone could see. Across the top, in bold print, was my name, Rachel Carter, sole owner. June 2018. Miller's voice faltered. For a moment, he didn't seem to know whether to speak or stay silent. His eyes flicked down at the documents, then back at me. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Even so," he said slower now, "this family arrangement, this exclusion of the Carters could be argued as a violation of spirit. A judge might recognize grounds for litigation." I leaned forward, my voice even but sharp. "Mr. Miller, those papers in front of you are not addendums. They are the master deeds. Everything else is secondary. And every signature on them is mine. The authority of this resort does not belong to Ethan. It does not belong to Charles. It belongs to me." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Ethan's smirk twitched, faltering at the edges. My father's face darkened. Miller opened his mouth again, but before he could gather another flimsy argument, the pavilion doors opened once more. The sound of polished shoes against marble silenced the room instantly. Judge Williams walked in. Tall-robed beneath a tailored coat, his presence carried weight before he even spoke. A hush fell over the staff lined along the walls. Even Miller's posture stiffened, his hand retreating from the page in front of him. The judge carried a slim file tucked under his arm. Without waiting to be announced, he stepped forward, placed it on the table beside Daniel's binder, and looked directly at the Carters. "I have reviewed the ownership documents," he said, his voice clear and firm. "They are valid, notarized, and beyond dispute. Rachel Carter is the sole proprietor of Seaside Crown Resort." Ethan took a step forward, desperation flaring in his eyes. "But she excluded us." Judge Williams didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "If you wish to pursue litigation, Mr. Carter, you may. But I must warn you, the losing side in such a case will not be Mrs. Carter." The words landed like a gavel. Ethan froze, his lips parting, but no sound escaping. His face drained of color, the arrogant smirk wiped clean. Sophie lowered her eyes, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress. My father stepped back as though the very ground had shifted beneath him. The silence stretched, filling every corner of the pavilion. I could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning, the faint rustle of paper as Daniel closed the binder with finality. I looked directly at Ethan. "You can hire an army of lawyers. You can twist words, delay hearings, file motions. But the law does not bend to arrogance. Today it stood exactly where it should, on the side of truth." His jaw clenched. His eyes burned with anger, but behind it I saw something else for the first time. Fear. For years they had treated me as invisible. Tonight I had forced them to see me not as an afterthought, not as the quiet sister in the corner, but as the one holding the documents that sealed their fate. Judge Williams gathered his file, gave me a brief nod, and left as quietly as he had entered. The echo of his steps lingered long after the doors closed. I turned back to my family. "This isn't about contracts," I said slowly. "It's about respect. And that is something you can't buy, can't argue, and can't steal. You either give it, or you lose everything." In that moment in their silence, I saw it clearly. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the shadow they dismissed. I was the person they had to face, bound by law, by truth, by the weight of every choice they had made. The pavilion held its breath. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his shoulders rigid. My father's gaze dropped to the floor. Sophie sat frozen, her lips pressed tight. And I, seated calmly at the head of the table, whispered the words that had been waiting on my tongue for decades. Justice has spoken. The chandelier light caught the polished brass plaque at the far end of the room, my name engraved into it, undeniable. And in their eyes, for the first time, I saw recognition. Not love, no apology, but recognition. And that was enough. I had thought the storm would end inside the pavilion. I had shown them the truth. The judge had spoken. That should have been enough. But this is not the world we live in anymore. Secrets don't stay secrets when every hand carries a phone. Within hours, the walls of Seaside Crown could no longer hold the story. It started with a shaky clip only 30 seconds long. Ethan's voice echoing sharp and angry, his finger jabbing at the counter. Then the frame widened, security standing firm, Daniel's calm voice carrying over the chaos. "This resort is owned by Rachel Carter." That one sentence was all it took. The caption that followed was, "Merciless brother band sister from family trip. Turns out she owns the whole resort." By evening, TikTok was flooded. 1 million views turned into 3, then 6. Instagram reels, Twitter threads, Facebook shares. Everywhere I looked, the story spread like wildfire. People weren't just watching. They were laughing, commenting, stitching the video with their own stories. This is karma served cold. Best family revenge story I've ever seen. Ethan thought he was the king, but Rachel built the castle. I watched as the comments rolled in. Strangers from across the country typing words I had longed to hear from my own family: respect, admiration, belief. But for Ethan, it was the opposite. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I know because the next morning he called me. His voice shook with fury and beneath it desperation. "Rachel, take it down. That video is destroying me. Do you hear me? My reputation, my career, it's all crashing because of you." I let him rant. Then, calm as ever, I said I didn't post it. "But if you think you can use the internet, be my guest." He cursed under his breath and hung up. Sophie reacted differently. She didn't yell. She didn't defend him. She just avoided me, her eyes darting away whenever we crossed paths. She knew what people were saying in her world, too. Interior design is built on image, and hers had crumbled overnight. I heard whispers from her colleagues' clients, pulling contracts, not wanting to be associated with the girlfriend of the fool on TikTok. Even my father couldn't escape it. His golf buddies, men who had always admired his proud talk of Ethan, started calling him directly. I overheard one conversation. "Charles, you let your son claim the family legacy, but your daughter owns it all, and you didn't know." The shame in my father's face was a mirror of the shame he had forced on me for years. He stayed quiet for hours that day, sitting by the window in silence. It was the first time I had ever seen him taste the bitter flavor of public judgment. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The world had taken the story and carried it farther than I ever planned. My family had humiliated me in private behind closed doors in hushed tones and cruel jokes. Now the tables had turned, and it was not me delivering the blow. It was millions of strangers typing their sentences of truth. I scrolled through Facebook one night, Olivia sitting beside me. The comments poured in. "This feels like my life. My brother got everything, I was left with nothing. I wish I had the courage Rachel had. She gives us hope. She shows us we're not alone. Olivia leaned her head against my shoulder, whispering, "They see you now, Mom. They finally see you." I couldn't deny it. For the first time, my story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become something bigger, a reflection of every woman who had been told she was less, every sister who had been pushed aside, every daughter ignored. But in the middle of that growing chorus, my family fractured further. Ethan stormed through the halls, snapping at staff, demanding the attention he no longer commanded. Sophie kept her distance, her phone glued to her hand as she frantically tried to salvage her image. And my father, he withered in silence, his authority dissolving with every phone call unanswered. The power had shifted not because I forced it, but because the truth had spilled into the open and refused to be contained. By the second day, the clip had reached the morning shows. Headlines splashed across the screen. Family feud at Florida resort goes viral. A panel of hosts laughed while replaying Ethan's outburst. He thought he booked the suite, but his sister owned the whole property. You can't script a better twist than that. Everywhere, the story was no longer about me being excluded. It was about justice turning in on itself, about arrogance exposed in the most public way possible. And as I sat in my suite, scrolling through thousands of comments from women I had never met, one truth settled over me. Justice does not always need a courtroom. Sometimes it only needs light. And once that light shines, the whole world can see what was hidden for so long. The resort was no longer a place of leisure. It had become a stage, and my family, once held up as the pride of Coral Gables, were the unwilling performers in a play the whole country was watching. Every glance from the staff, every murmur from passing guests carried the same verdict: judgment. That night at dinner, the weight of it settled on us all. The dining hall glittered with candlelight-polished silverware lined neatly like soldiers, crystal glasses shimmering as if nothing outside these walls had changed. But at the table itself there was no warmth, no tradition, no laughter. Only tension thick enough to choke. Sophie's mask slipped first. She had played the part of the poised partner for days, but the pressure of whispers, the viral videos, the stares from strangers had worn her down. Her polished smile was gone, replaced with sharp impatience. She slammed her napkin onto the table, the sound sharp as a slap. "Ethan," she said, her voice cutting through the room, "you have nothing. Nothing but the Carter name. And right now that name is a joke. I will not stay with a man who has become a punchline." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan froze, his fork clattering against porcelain. His voice cracked as he tried to rally. This is Rachel's fault, if she hadn't. But Sophie didn't wait for him to finish. She stood with a deliberate grace, her chair scraping back against marble. In one motion, she grabbed her purse. Her suitcase, already packed and waiting by the door, rolled behind her as her heels struck the floor like a gavel. The echo of her departure was final, sharp, undeniable. Ethan's hand lifted instinctively, as if he could pull her back with will alone. For the first time in my life, I saw him stripped of the armor of arrogance. His face collapsed inward, his stature smaller, his voice gone. Silence spread. My father broke it, his voice carrying not rage this time, but a weary, leaden grief. He leaned forward, his eyes shadowed. "Rachel," he said the words, bitter, "you've torn this family apart." I met his gaze steadily. "No, Dad. You and Ethan did that long ago, when you chose favoritism over fairness, when you stood silent while I was dismissed, when you acted as though I didn't exist. Tonight isn't me breaking the family. Tonight is a mirror, and the cracks you see have always been there." The words landed heavy. No one rushed to Ethan's defense. No one laughed to lighten the blow. The room for once acknowledged the truth. Then Mark shifted. My youngest brother, quiet as a shadow, through this entire trip, finally moved. He reached across the table, his hand firm over mine. His voice was soft, but it carried more than all of Ethan's shouting had. "Rachel's right. She has always been right. I'm ashamed I stayed quiet. I let you all treat her like she was less, and I never said a word. That's on me." The admission broke something in my father. His shoulders slumped, his face fell. The authority that had once been iron around him melted into something brittle. His word had always been final in our house, but not here, not tonight. Ethan's eyes darted from me to Mark, wide with disbelief. His little brother, the one he had always expected to follow him blindly, had stepped away from him, and worse, had chosen me. Ethan sank back into his chair, his body folding in on itself. His head bowed, his hands limp against the table. For the first time in his life, he had no clever insult, no smug smirk, no fight left. Olivia's hand found mine under the table, her grip steady. When I looked at her, her eyes glowed not with the pain I had seen before, but with pride. At 14, she understood what took me decades to learn. Standing alone is still standing. The room itself seemed to feel the shift. The food sat untouched. The candles flickered low, and the air was thick with something that had no name, but was felt by everyone. The Carter family, once paraded as a symbol of unity, was fractured openly, the pieces scattered across the table. My father sat defeated. My brother sat abandoned. And I, the forgotten one, remained upright. But I did not smile. The hollow satisfaction of revenge had never been my goal. What I wanted was freedom from the years of being unseen, from the judgment that had pressed down on me since childhood, from the shadow they forced me into. Tonight I felt it loosening. Yet even in that freedom I knew the story was not finished. Because what follows the collapse of a family is not silence, it is the question of what comes after. And I was ready for the first time to answer it on my own terms. That summer ended nothing like the ones before. The beach house was no longer a symbol of family reunions, no longer a place to pretend everything was perfect. It had become proof, living proof, that the truth cannot be buried forever. And Rachel Carter. I stepped out of the role of the outsider. I stood as myself without apology. The next morning I asked Maria Sanchez to meet me in the resort office. She looked nervous, clutching a worn notebook in her hands. She probably thought I had called her in to reprimand her for speaking out against Ethan. Instead, I motioned for her to sit. In front of the management board, I said, "From today forward, Maria is promoted to supervisor of housekeeping. No one will ever dismiss her dedication again." For a moment, she just blinked at me. Then the tears came. She covered her face with both hands, then rushed forward and hugged me. "I never thought fairness would come for someone like me," she whispered. The room erupted in applause. I held her shoulders firmly and told her, "You deserve this." Later that week, I gathered the staff, community leaders, and partners for a small press announcement. I unveiled something I had been quietly working on for months: the Linda Carter Scholarship. A program for students pursuing hospitality, named for my mother. My mother sat in the front row, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. Her eyes glistened. "I'm proud of you," she murmured, her voice breaking. In that instant, I felt something loosen inside me. She had never defended me against my father, but now she looked at me not with pity, but with recognition. That was enough. Meanwhile, Ethan and my father left the resort without a word. No shouting, no arguments, just silence. Each carried the weight of what they had lost. I didn't stop them, nor did I feel triumph. Revenge had already been served. Now their healing, if it was ever to come, was theirs to face. The real closure came at the end of summer gala. The pavilion glowed with lanterns, the sea breeze carrying laughter and music. I walked up onto the stage, looking out over the crowd staff. In their uniforms, guests in evening attire, neighbors from the Coral Gables community. For once, all eyes on me were filled with respect, not skepticism. I took a breath and began. Justice isn't just about punishment. Justice is about truth being brought into the light. It's about making sure that every person here, guest or employee, knows they are valued the same. The applause that followed was not polite but heartfelt. It washed over me, warm and steady. And then I saw Olivia sitting at the front, clapping harder than anyone, her smile wide and unguarded. She knew. She knew that her mother had not only stood up for herself, but had changed something bigger for her for the future. From that season on, I developed a ritual. Each morning before diving into meetings and phone calls, I would pause in front of the polished plaque outside my office. Rachel Carter, owner, It wasn't just a nameplate. It was a reminder of the journey, the fights, the silence, the tears, and the moment I had finally broken free. And so the story of my family trip ended here not with anger but with clarity. Not with vengeance, but with justice. Now I'll leave you with a question. If one day your own family tried to erase your worth, would you stay silent and endure? Or would you rise and show them who you really